Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Santa Clara County Empathy, Fatigue, and Burnout Training. Before we get started, we do have a few Zoom housekeeping rules where live transcript function available. We will give you a prompt soon to utilize the chat box where you can ask questions and comments. And if you have any tech issues, please message me. I'm Sadaka at sadakahomebaseccc.org. And a quick intro of myself. My name is Sadaka. I'm from Homebase. We're a nonprofit technical assistance provider. We provide TA for COCs across the nation. We work closely with Santa Clara County's Office of Supportive Housing. One of the many things we do in that scope is bring you trainings on behalf of OSH, including this empathy, fatigue, and burnout training. We are constantly looking to improve our training, so we will be posting a feedback form specific to this training in the chat later toward the end of the training that we really hope you take a second to fill out. It really helps us tailor our trainings, ensure that we are getting your content and topic areas that you want to learn more about. And in the chat, if you could put your name, agency, and what is one thing that brought you joy yesterday. And I will pass it on to my colleague, Nicole Johnson, who will be providing you this presentation today.
Thanks, Sadaka. Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you all today. Again, my name is Nicole Johnson. I'm a directing attorney here at Homebase. And I always like to give the disclaimer that this is not legal advice. We're just sharing information for the purposes of education and training only. There's no like litigation or anything going on. Some people always have that question whenever one of our staff members that's an attorney introduces themselves with their title. So I want to make sure that that's clear. I also come to you as a former clinical social worker. I ran shelters in the DC area for about 12 years before I became an attorney. And so it's something that I am really close to, like the work, the stress that comes with that work, the way that we as case managers, social workers, and everybody that interacts with the clients that we are serving, that is something that I identify with wholeheartedly. So this is not just, these are the things you should look out for. These are the things that you should know from a textbook. Some of this is also going to be like real life experience too. So today we're going to be talking about empathy, fatigue, and burnout. I'm going to go over some definitions so that we're all speaking the same language here. Then we'll talk about some ways that we can mitigate the effects of empathy fatigue. We'll cover secondary trauma and stress. We'll also talk about some ways that we can mitigate burnout, and then ways that our agencies can support us as staff members through the culture of our work environments, and also including some tips that you can use, for yourself to kind of do that independently if you're at an agency that's not going to be as supportive as you would like, or in a way that would be most helpful for you. We can go to the next slide, please. And the next one, thank you. Right. So the norms for today, we are going to try to be as present as we can, recognizing that everybody takes in information in a different way. We don't all have to be enthusiastic. We don't all have to like shout to participate and raise our hands. You're not going to get any of that from me. Respect when others are speaking. All perspectives and values are appreciated here today. And when we're sharing, we want to share from our own experience. We don't want to talk about what other people might feel. We just want to keep it to talking about ourselves. We value confidentiality. So again, personal sharing is going to stay in this group when we leave. And please engage. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them. There'll be some time at the end, definitely for questions and answers. You can also drop questions in the chat and others are welcome to respond. We can go to the next slide, please. Right. So empathy, fatigue, burnout, and other terms. This is where we're going to get into some definitions. We can go to the next slide. So again, I want to emphasize, and you'll hear me say this throughout this presentation, we're talking about empathy fatigue, which is not the same as compassion. A lot of times people who are in direct services, many folks that are working directly with people who need help, healthcare workers, case managers, social workers, we tend to feel like our compassion for the people that we're serving, it's what's driving us, but that can also be confused with empathy fatigue, right? So you can experience burnout when the empathy doesn't lead to compassion, and we'll go over that in a little more detail later on. We can go to the next slide, please. So this is the long definition of empathy. I'm not going to read it to you all because you all can, read. Your skilled practitioners. You've got this. Basically, what empathy boils down to is that thing that allows us to not sympathize with, but understand at some level what other people are feeling. So for example, if we're talking about folks who are experiencing homelessness, we can, even if we have never experienced homelessness, we can on some level understand how scary or confusing that might be, how distraught we might be if we were in that situation. And when we're engaging in empathy a lot, so when we're feeling those feels during this work, especially when we have to deal with the negative emotions of other people. So, by negative emotions, the things that don't make us happy and giddy. So, when people aren't feeling love, when people aren't feeling happy, when people aren't feeling joy, when they're distraught, when they're stressed out, when we can see that coming through, there are a few things that can happen for us, the people that are working. So sometimes people develop what we often refer to as a thick skin, right? We kind of tune out the feeling so that we can focus on the task at hand. There's also the process of empathetic distress, which is when all the things are going on and you're, I'm so sorry, something just fell off of my wall, you all. Okay. So, empathetic distress is when you are kind of going through the process of feeling all those feelings, and it's kind of overwhelming to you as the person who's feeling and listening and trying to help. And then compassion and empathetic concern. That is when you're feeling the feels and you feel them in a way that's, I would describe it as almost an intimate feeling, like the person. A lot of times what we hear people say is my heart went out to them, or I felt that pain. It felt like it was happening to me. These are the three things that can happen when we experience empathy on the side of the helper a lot. We can go to the next slide. So, empathetic distress. It's basically a strong, aversive, and self oriented response to the suffering of others and the desire to withdraw from that situation to protect ourselves. Again, this is, oh my gosh, my heart went out to them. This is so, so sad. And then kind of like a wall goes up so that you don't have to feel those feelings. And what that translates to for a lot of people in the helping professions is when you are experiencing something personally. So maybe I'll use myself an example since I said we're only going to talk about our own stuff. I am someone who identifies as a person with lived experience of homelessness. I grew up experiencing chronic homelessness from childhood all the way through my early adult life. Literally went from homeless in a shelter to case manager of another shelter when I finished school and had my degree. So sometimes early on in my career, I would be sitting and listening to these like gut wrenching stories of how people landed in their current situations. And I had to put on the thick skin so that one, I wasn't crying when they were talking to me, so that I wasn't reliving my own trauma when they were talking to me and feeling that more intensely. And then when it got to the point where something like personal would happen, say, for example, there was a death in the family, I've got no emotion, I've got no feeling to it because every day at work, I'm dealing with this very tough emotional stuff. And I have to put on my thick skin, I have to put on that armor so that I can be an effective case manager, so that I can take care of the person that I'm supposed to be helping. That is an example of empathetic distress. That's how we see it play out with people whose jobs are to help other people. And then chronic empathetic distress. So when you do that over and over and over and over, that is what becomes empathy fatigue. And then the empathy fatigue leads to burnout. And we'll describe burnout in the next slide. We can go to the next one, please. So burnout is just that exhaustion. It's like emotional, mental, and sometimes it can be physical exhaustion. And again, it's caused by that repeated stress, that empathy fatigue, or that empathetic distress that we just talked about. Sometimes what this looks like in practice is the person who just um, you're tired of responding to those emails, right? You just put it off over and over and over again. And it's not because you don't have the time, it's because you are just tired and drained. It's when you walk into work and you're constantly, rolling your head because your shoulders are tight or your neck hurts. It's coming into the office and you just don't feel good or you feel tired and sluggish every time it's time for work, but when you're not at work, you feel fine. I like to remind people this is also the point when we start sending out our resumes. We start looking for other jobs because our job, we describe it as, is too stressful. There are too many things going on. I don't like it here anymore. I'm not thriving in this role. We sometimes lose our motivation to do the thing it is that we are doing, something that we were, a few months ago or maybe a year ago, so enthusiastic about, so excited to come in and do the work. Now we're just tired of doing the work. That is an example of burnout, the way it plays out for people in the helping professions. We can go to the next slide, please. And this is just a graphic of all the things I just described, right? So, first, it's empathy. Those are the feelings where you identify with someone else's suffering. And then that's the empathetic stress. That's your own body's natural response to the stress that you're hearing, that you're taking in. And then over and over and over, that leads to empathy fatigue. And the empathy fatigue, again, leads to burnout. Now, if you take a look back at the empathy column, that green area, you're going to see the green line pointing down to compassion. We are able to prevent the empathy fatigue and burnout when we experience compassion instead of empathetic distress. And that's a learned skill. It's not something that just happens. So we can go to the next slide, please. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later, too. So another visual about what empathy fatigue looks like. Um, so there are some psychological distress symptoms. So again, that's like emotional. It can be anxiety. It could be dread. It could be grief. It could be like imagery or dreams about what you are hearing from work. So for example, well, we hear people a lot of times say, I just can't turn my brain off when I leave work, or I'm still thinking about my clients. I cannot take that vacation and really relax because if I'm not there, the work's not getting done and people aren't getting what they need. That constant like thinking about it and kind of agonizing over it or experiencing literally psychological distress about the things going on at work. That's what empathy fatigue looks like. It can also result in some cognitive shifts. So that's like increased suspicion of others. In our work, that might look like feeling the need to do all the things that other people are supposed to do because you don't trust any other case manager or any other service provider to meet the need of your client. So you're taking it all on and doing it yourself. There can also be some cynicism there. So it's never going to change, right? This is just how it is. We're just pushing people through the system. And then something that we also see a lot is kind of blaming the person who is in front of us. So blaming our client. Whereas when we were, new case managers, new social workers, new people in the field, we were operating more from a strengths perspective. We were looking at all the things that our clients had that were serving them well that could help them. We were looking at all the systemic issues that were contributing to the current needs that they were experiencing. Now it's starting to change a bit. Now we're starting to focus in on some of those barriers and we're making them larger. And for example, that client who is just not showing up to meetings, they're not engaged, they're not doing all the things that you would want them to do. Whereas early on in your career, you might have stopped and said, what's preventing this client? What's stopping this client from engaging with me? What can I do better? And now that you're experiencing empathy fatigue, it's just like they missed 3 meetings, strike, 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 kicking them out of the program. They are lazy. They don't want to participate. You're saying things to your clients like, if you're not going to work hard, I'm not going to work hard. That is an example of empathy fatigue. playing out. There can also be some disturbance in relationships. So, again, that decreased trust in personal or professional relationships. That, again, talking about, I'm going to do all the things because I don't trust another service provider to do it. Sometimes this can trickle into our personal relationships because we're carrying this with us so often. Sometimes it also looks like an over identification with the clients, and becoming like overly responsive or kind of feeling like you can't do anything, like paralyzed with fear or just nervousness or anxiety about what to do next for your client because you're so connected or so like intertwined with their own issues. And then the changes to frame of reference. So that's a disconnection from your own identity. We see this with people who just, for example, that person in the office or at the agency where their total identity is wrapped up in what they do for work. They are working with clients day and night. They don't take time off. They're doing things on the weekend. Even when they don't have to, they're still doing it. And it's a level above the person that's just going above and beyond. It's to the point where everybody can see that, this is all you do. You don't have anything separate in your life from this work. We can go to the next slide, please.
And Nicole, before we go to the next slide, there's a question in the chat. What's the distinction between setting boundaries or expectations and empathy fatigue?
Clifford, can you expand on that question a little more? Do you mean like expectations and boundaries between ourselves and the clients? Or
Yeah, so something like, something I hear sometimes from people telling me how to, you know, avoid empathy fatigue is like don't work harder than the client. Um and so how and you mentioned like, well, if they're not going to work hard, then I'm not going to work hard. So like what's the distinction between, is it like the intention or what's the um because I've also found myself falling into that, like, well, this person isn't calling me back and I'm gonna like release the bandwidth for that person. But like what's the difference between that being symptoms of empathy fatigue as opposed to just setting boundaries with that client?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we all know when a client is just not participating. So like when we've exhausted all of our efforts, we've done all the things that we can reasonably do. So we've called the client. If it's within our purview, within our jobs, we've gone out to wherever we know the client may be because maybe they just can't access the phone right now. Maybe they have trouble with that form of communication. When we've tried all the things that we know to do, we've talked to our supervisor, we've gotten some more tips, and our frame of thinking is not, I'm not going to do these things because this client is not showing up. That's different from a client that's just not showing up and your hands are tied, right? Like you can only do so much. There are some limitations, but the line I would say for empathy fatigue is when your immediate response is they're not doing it, so I'm not doing it without trying all those other things first.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Does that clear that up?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, we can already there. What does burnout look like? So, again, burnout is a symptom of empathy fatigue. And this just expands some of the things we talked about earlier, but it's all laid out here for your reference when you get the slides later. One thing that I really want to point out is substance use. And now I'm absolutely not here to make anybody feel bad about being a grown up if everybody's over 21 and using like illegal substances. But what I do want to point out is that statistically, people in helping professions, lawyers, case managers, social workers, healthcare professionals, we all have like the highest rate of substance use disorders in like different out of different fields because we sometimes use it to cope, sometimes to kind of, I'm off work, I need my whiskey sour because today was a day and I just want to relax and decompress. And this helps me decompress. But if we're doing that every single time, that's when we need to like step back and take a look and see if there's something else that we can do to debrief. And if we're having to do that in order to separate, that is a red flag that we might be burned out. We might be experiencing empathy fatigue. The same way we would raise that concern to a client, we want to think about it for ourselves. If every day you've got to have a drink or you've got to smoke or you've got to do something else to take away the work, and there's not like an underlying medical issue, you don't have an anxiety disorder, you're not, dealing with something else, and you're using something under those parameters, if it's just to get away from the day you had at work, and that's every day that you work, that's a sign that burnout or empathy fatigue is going on. We can go to the next slide, please. All right, silent reflection. We just took in a lot. So for the next 3 minutes, I would like everyone to just take a moment to reflect on what we've discussed. Consider, where you see yourself on the empathy to burnout continuum. So going from, experiencing empathy fatigue, maybe compassion or not, and then it's going all the way through that cycle that we discussed. And then what questions do you have about any of the definitions that we just went over today? And we are doing that time now. While folks are thinking, if you have other questions, if you come up with questions in the reflection, please feel free to also drop them in the chat. See a hand up, Jennifer? We'll give it about 1 more minute. All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope that was helpful as we process what we are learning and hearing today. We can go to the next slide, please. And now we're going to get into compassion as an antidote to empathy fatigue. This is what I was describing earlier with that little green line that went down to compassion. We can go to the next slide. So compared to empathy, and this also goes along with the question that we had about the line between like boundaries and what's a boundary and what's empathy fatigue. So again, empathy is our just ability to understand the perspective or the feelings that other folks might have. And compassion is when those feelings and thoughts include the desire to help. So what that means is that we're able to kind of step out of the feelings and ask ourselves, what can we do? How can we help make this better? And this is why I say it relates to the question that we have, because when you feel the compassion, it's the, what can I do? Let me get into gear. Let me go help. Let me take action. Versus with empathy fatigue, there's no desire to really, or you skip having that desire to take the action or that feeling of needing to go do something helpful. We can go to the next slide. So there are 4 steps of compassion. Now I'm going to give you a fair warning. This gets a little bit technical, but I want to point out that these are things that most of us already do. I think it's just generally difficult for like the scholars and the researchers to put these things into like very clear words where we are adequately describing all the things that we feel. And I also want to highlight just understanding that we as people process information and feel things differently. So, what is sad to me may not be sad to you. What is distressing to you may not be distressing to me. So, if I am talking about compassion, leave out something that you may feel or describe something and it doesn't match your experience, that doesn't mean that you are not experiencing compassion. It doesn't mean that you aren't doing these things. These are just the descriptions based off the research. And it could very well be that you are not the only person who is feeling what you feel. It's just that that hasn't been captured in the research because I am presenting information based on the research and like the clinical standards and definitions and things like that. So I want to put that out there. Okay, so 4 steps to compassion. Compassion has a 4 step process, and it's basically pointing to where the empathy fatigue can kind of rear its head and step in. So, the first step is identifying the suffering in another person. So, you're identifying the thing that's not good. And again, this is also going to be subjective because what one person may consider suffering, another person may not. It may just be a part of their culture feeling or thinking what that must be like. That's the empathy. Connecting with your desire to alleviate that suffering. That is something that is typically, I would call it a natural response. We generally don't want to see other people in distress. We don't want to see other people suffering, and then taking action to alleviate that suffering. And so when that process goes through each different step, that is compassion. But what often happens is some people get stuck at number 2. Some people get stuck at feeling or thinking how awful that may be. And when you do that, that is what leads to the empathy fatigue. And I also want to highlight here that this process should happen at the kind of like the very moment that you experience the empathy fatigue or the empathy, excuse me. And that's the difference between going from feeling the empathy to empathy fatigue and burnout is that you don't complete that full cycle of identifying the suffering and taking action to alleviate at the initial onset. So at the initial introduction. So client wants it to your office. They're experiencing some horribly traumatic event. You identify with that. You think, oh my gosh, this must be so horrible for them. And that's it. You are not really connecting your desire to alleviate the suffering or taking action. And this is where it gets hard for me as like a facilitator because I've been in the role of the person taking in all this information and having to do it. We all have processes, right? So you may be following like your case management or your intake protocol, whatever that is. And so on paper, you're going from step 1 that's on your screen to step 4. But this is talking about the internal work of going through step 4, not just going through the motions because it's what we have to do. We've got to move people through our doors. We've got to go through our process. We've got to fill out those forms. And sometimes going through the motions and filling out those forms and getting them through the next step of their journey doesn't mean that we are going through the next step in this compassion cycle. Like we're stopping at 2. We're feeling the feels and we're not internally feeling motivated to help them. We're not internally feeling like we need to take action. And that is one of the easier said than done kind of things within this helping profession. We can go to the next slide, please. So empathetic distress versus compassion. This is, again, the visual of what I just described. So empathy is we feel in the feels. Compassion is we've got those 4 steps. We're taking action. But if we skip the compassion, we go straight to empathetic distress. And then that's what leads us, again, to burnout. We can go to the next slide. So what do we do when we can't do anything, right? So when we're talking about the steps to compassion and we get to step 4, that taking action step, again, this includes internal actions and personal practices that are going to focus on us being able to cope and find healthy ways when there's no external action we can do to alleviate the suffering. There's nothing we can do to really make this situation better for the people that we want to help, because we don't control all of that. We don't have the magic ball. From my perspective, we don't have the money, because we know that typically that solves a lot of our clients' problems, and we can't just fix it. We can't snap our fingers and make it go away. But sometimes there are a few tips that we can take. One is mental reframing. We do this with our clients. We try to get people to change their perspective, but we also have to do that with ourselves. So reminding ourselves that you've done all that you can all that you can do today. If you got them in the door, you completed that intake, you got them signed up for services, you told them what information they needed, you met with them, they felt heard, they felt seen, you did what you could do, right? That is the first step to helping them to alleviate that suffer. Another thing is self-compassion. You want to help, but you can't. And that's also an experience of suffering. And just reminding yourself of that is a good practice. Loving kindness. So wishing the other person well, sitting with the feelings of compassion for them. That is just kind of taking a moment and saying, you know what? I hope they're going to be okay. There's nothing I could do about it, but I hope they're going to be okay. And one of the things that I like to recommend people to do is, again, easier said than done, but taking a moment to do that with yourself after every client interaction. I know sometimes the days get full and you are back to back, you don't have a moment in between folks, but if it's the time that you take to close out their screen and open another, if it's the physical process of you putting back a paper file and getting another, if it's walking down the hall, if it's going to the bathroom, if it's sipping from your water bottle, you take that sip, and while you're drinking, I did everything that I could do for that person. Sip. There is nothing else that I can do. Sip. I wish them well, and I am, kind of washing my hands of it. Sip. That is helping you to kind of release some of that and move on to step 4, the taking action to alleviate the suffering, because you and I know that there's nothing you can actually do to take that thing away from them. We can go to the next slide, please. The compassion cultivation. So again, this is just a visual of some of the benefits that we get when we start to cultivate compassion or practice going through those 4 steps of compassion for ourselves. That's increased happiness, increased calmness, acceptance of like the things we can't change, connection with other people, and our overall well-being, and things that decrease stress, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, empathy, fatigue, and burnout. We can go to the next slide, please. Now we're going to chat about secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma. We can go to the next slide, please. Right, so for the rest of the slides, secondary traumatic stress is going to be STS, and vicarious trauma is going to be VT, because all of that does not fit nicely on every single slide. So empathy fatigue, empathetic distress, and burnout, they can all happen without actually interacting with the people who have experienced trauma. Some of that can come from just reading those case files. Some of it can come from just knowing the things that happen to other people. And secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma come from hearing about those clients' traumas and those experiences. So, for example, if you are maybe a supervisor and you're not interacting with clients anymore, but you're supervising a team that is, you can still experience empathy fatigue. You can still experience that secondary traumatic stress because you're still hearing about it. You're still knowing the things that happen. We can go to the next slide. And the next slide is just going to be the actual definitions of these things. So secondary traumatic stress is the emotional distress that you get when you hear about trauma that someone else experienced firsthand. It can be suddenly, like right after someone shares their story with you. It can also happen over time when you read bits and pieces, when you hear about something on the news. Vicarious trauma is the negative reaction to ongoing trauma exposure, and it includes a broader range of symptoms. So that's like a shift in someone's attitude or worldview after they are exposed to someone suffering repeatedly over time. In practice, we call that, the person who is just tired. They've been doing, they'll often describe themselves as, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I was doing this work and working with these people before you were born, and they are all the same. That is the attitude shift and the worldview after that repeated exposure to this stress from clients who are experiencing similar types of traumas. Now, sometimes you might not literally think that the trauma is happening to you or the people that you love. It can be more like you take on some of those negative feelings and mindsets that go along with someone else's trauma. It's like a weight. Using myself as an example, again, I used to be a child welfare social worker. And then when I started practicing law, I was in child welfare law. So I was representing people who, some of them had abused and neglected their children. And this is also coming after my career as a social worker, where I was a therapist for kids who had been neglected and abused, and also sometimes the court appointed therapist for people who were convicted of like pretty heinous crimes and whatnot against children. And then, y'all, I went and had a baby. And I could not shift that perspective of knowing that there are adults who harm children. And so my worldview was very much influenced by my professional experience. I experienced vicarious trauma. Like I literally had to go to therapy to be able to let my kid go to daycare because I had seen and read about all these instances. I had worked with people who had done some of these things. And so I knew that it was a possibility. And my worldview, my perspective went from the world is safe to the world is awful and dangerous for kids. And that is an example of experiencing vicarious trauma. I myself had not experienced abuse as a child, but because I had worked so closely with people who had and knew that it was a possibility, I couldn't turn this off. And this is, 10, 12 years of this kind of professional experience that completely impacted my personal worldview. And I didn't know it happened until it happened. So that's an example of vicarious trauma. We can go to the next slide, please. So some of the signs and symptoms. So signs and symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, feeling that other people's trauma is yours. And these are symptoms are going to be similar to like PTSD. So post-traumatic stress disorder. So being like kind of jumpy or feeling on guard all the time. An excessive worry that something bad is going to happen to you or people you love or your colleagues, or even physical signs of anxiety or stress, that racing heart, the shortness of breath, tension headaches. Some signs of vicarious trauma, lingering feelings that are strong, like anger, rage, intense sadness about this specific traumatic experience that is not yours. Constantly thinking about your client's experiences. You can feel exhausted all the time. There can be some level of social withdrawal and basically all the symptoms of depression. So you experience the same psychological and sometimes physical symptoms that the person who actually experienced the trauma might feel. We can go to the next slide. And so all of these, empathy fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, and vicarious trauma, they all contribute to someone experiencing burnout. We can go to the next slide. And now we're going to talk about the more pleasant things, addressing burnout, things that we can do to try to stop some of these not great feelings. We can go to the next slide. And this is important because we want to better serve our clients. We want to accomplish, our agency's goals and whatnot, but also because we want to be healthy and whole. We want to be able to go do the work, and we want to still be okay when we go home and do the things that are important to us and the things that we care about. We can go to the next slide. Again, giving another disclaimer here, that what I share may not be applicable to you. Just again, want to acknowledge that people have different cultures, different values, and the way we address burnout might be different. Some people might turn to their faith, some people might turn to external factors. There is no right or wrong. It is whatever works for you. And these, again, are just going to be examples. So, one of the ways that we can prevent burnout and address burnout within our organization is using trauma informed care at the organizational level. So, not the way you interact with your clients from an trauma informed care approach, which is just understanding that people come to the table with different experiences of trauma, and that might impact how they interact with and view the world around them. That means that your agency is also implementing that in the way that they supervise staff, in the way that they, set up practices, for example, time off that you could take or the benefits that you receive through your job. You can also prevent and address burnout through debriefing with your supervisor or colleagues, balance and boundaries. So making sure that you turn off work when it's time to turn off work, and you're not, engaging with people all day and all night, every single day of the week, if that's not your job. Having some form of support and being able to really communicate with folks that you need to communicate with. We can go to the next slide. So when we talk about trauma informed care, I'm going to just briefly talk about trauma informed supervision. That means that your supervisor is recognizing the effects of secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma. They're being responsive to staff's needs. The slide says express needs, but I want to make sure that or emphasize that a good supervisor is also going to be able to recognize when something is going on with a staff member and they might not be expressing that need. Supervisors are also going to use strength-based approaches in case management interactions to prevent problems before they start. We're going to go to the next slide, please. We talked about debriefing. So debriefing can look like, immediately after you have a difficult case or not too far apart, you're debriefing on those difficult cases. You're talking about them with somebody else. You're saying, this is what happened and this is how I feel. And that creates an opportunity for the person you're talking to say, wow, that's tough. I would have felt that too. Or what are some things that you can do to try to get over that hump, to feel better, to go through those 4 steps of compassion. Debriefing also encourages staff to develop self-awareness about the type and the frequency of debriefing that's most effective for them. So some people may need to debrief immediately after. It may only be that they need to do it immediately after in certain kinds of cases. This is particularly important when we talk about hiring diverse staff, including staff that have lived experience of homelessness. If somebody has lived experience of homelessness and they get a person in front of them that's going through the exact experience that they went through, they're going to feel that in some way. And so they may need a process or some tips, some help to make sure that they're able to debrief that, whether they want to talk about it with you, with their supervisor, with a colleague, or just have a moment to themselves. We need to make sure that that is a practice that's implemented and allowed and encouraged within our agencies. We want to support staff to keep their perspective when discussing clients. So we, again, always want to keep the perspective of the clients. We don't want to put too much of ourselves in that, because it's not us that's living out these situations, it's our clients. And we also here want to think about the different cultures that may be going on and the way those factors may influence what's going on with our clients. And then debriefing can also offer suggestions and practical tools to deal with the impacts of those experiences. So a supervisor might remind you to take a breath. A supervisor might remind you to stop and pay attention to whether or not you've gone through those 4 steps of compassion. A supervisor might highlight, what? You've had a lot of difficult cases in the last week. Maybe you should take some extra time for lunch today. These are all just tools and tactics that we can use in debriefing sessions. We can go to the next slide, please. So balance and boundaries. We want supervisors to be encouraged to discuss frontline staff's work-life balance. But again, that may not be a comfortable topic for everybody. I am someone, again, using myself as the example, I don't really like to talk about my personal life at work. I like to keep a straight line. Y'all don't come over here. I don't bring it over there. So it gives me like the icks when someone asks about like my kid by name, because I'm like, why do you know my kid's name? That's my personal business. But for somebody else, that might be something that is really helpful for them. It shows them that you as a supervisor, or that their supervisor has taken an interest in them, and kind of centers them and brings like them back to themselves, or brings you back to yourself when you've been caught up in this bubble of trauma all day at work. Supervisors can also work with staff, or if you are a supervisor, you can work with your staff to prioritize tasks within your caseload, and really drive in the message that like all tasks aren't equal value. And I think you all know what that means. Like some people have very immediate needs that are more critical that you need to address, and some tasks might be able to wait until the next day. So supervisors should be helping people who are doing the direct work kind of make those distinctions. So in real life, that might look like you as the case manager, you have your task list of 50 things that you need to do before you clock out for the day. We know that you're not getting 50 things done in the next 3 hours. So that might look like your supervisor stepping in and talking through in a few minutes, 5-10 minutes. These are some of the things that you think you should prioritize, and your supervisor is saying, maybe you should change that list, or yes, that sounds right to me, go ahead. But that helps you create the balance. And for the person that's receiving the supervision, it kind of gives permission to go home and just go home and not have to worry about the work. And then the kind of encouragement that says, it's not the end of the world if you don't get all these things done, right? If you don't get all of these things done, it is not going to result in some dire consequence for your client. And if it is, because of the nature of this work, sometimes that is very much the case. I, as your supervisor, I'm going to step in to help you, or I'm going to take some of this other work and unload it from you so that you can work on this thing that seems to be very important for you to handle yourself. And that goes into being flexible with changing deadlines and goals, or reassigning tasks as needed. And then supervision can also encourage boundary settings and help staff figure out ways that you can kind of take space when you need it, and protect yourself from the very real harm and impacts of doing this kind of work. So again, that could be an example of, if they can't give you an extra day off, because sometimes that's out of folks' control, they can turn the other way when you take a long lunch break, right? Or, maybe you need to flex some time so that you can just take a minute in the morning because you had to work late that night. They're telling you it's okay if you miss the staff meeting, because I know that you really just need a moment to yourself after the day you had yesterday. And these are also suggestions that you can make if you don't have a supervisor that's offering these things, if you don't have someone that's giving you these kind of like freedoms and flexibilities. Those are things that you can do. And part of that means that you also have to know what you need, based on your responsibilities of your role, and just how you operate and how you internalize and how you process some of the heavy load that you have in the work that you do. And I'll say it, since other people might not be able to. Hopefully, I won't get in trouble for it. Sometimes the places that we work can't give us what we need to deal with the stuff that we're dealing with. And it might be a situation where, to avoid burnout, we've got to find another place to go work, because we still want to do the type of work, we still want to serve the people that we're serving, but it just may be that the environment we're working in is not conducive to us doing that work in a healthy way. We can go to the next slide, please. So now, just talking about support and what that looks like. So support is going to promote a feeling of psychological safety and respect different ways that we interact with each other. Again, it's going to use a strength-based approach and supervision. For supervisors, you're going to be frequently complimenting your staff on their work. Even some quick positive feedback can go a long way. And then avoid micromanaging and give employees more control over how they work. And if you're not a supervisor, you can apply this by thinking about how it relates to what you need as someone who is being supervised. So that might look like when your supervisor asks you a question like, is there anything I can do to help you? You might say, sometimes I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. So it would be helpful if you let me know. Or I work better when I have an opportunity to just troubleshoot something on my own. And since I know you need to know that I'm working towards it, would you like me to give you updates as I'm processing? That can be an example of how you avoid being micromanaged. We can go to the next slide, please. And we'll talk about communication. So to yourself, think about, what from these you would like your organization to do more of, which would be most helpful for you. And again, these are also tactics that you can take into your supervision meetings. And if you're a supervisor, these are tasks that you can try to make sure that you are implementing during supervision meetings when you're working with your staff. So, example, listening closely to any expressed concern and making sure that you follow up. If you're the person being supervised, express your concerns and make sure you follow up. If it's not addressed at the end of the meeting, hey, did you have a suggestion for that thing that I mentioned? Or maybe following up via email. Just wanted to circle back to this issue that was going on. Another thing that supervisors can do is take staff feedback seriously and let them know the results of their feedback. So if staff said this 2-hour weekly staff meeting is taking up too much of my time, and I don't have the capacity to do the things that I need to do for these clients and take care of myself, someone should be like, hey, we heard you. And here's what we're thinking about doing with the staff meetings to make sure that you all have the time and space that you need. Again, supervisors can be flexible in changing deadlines and goals and reassigning tasks as needed. If you are the person being supervised, this is something you can ask for. Come up with a plan and ask for a few tasks to be given to somebody else. Ask for maybe a lighter caseload to be passed along to someone else, or a lighter case to be passed to someone else because you have a case that's very complex and it's requiring a lot more of your time and energy, and you don't have the capacity to hold all of these complex cases. And then supervisors can collaborate with staff to create a plan that address their needs and includes different self-care activities. And if you're not a supervisor, you can suggest something. You can maybe create a list of things that are helpful for you and ask your supervisor, are there resources within our company that can help me do these things, right? Sometimes it looks like there might be an employee assistance program that you can take advantage of. If you are like a social worker, for example, your local NASW, National Association of Social Workers, might have some local resources that you can take advantage of, just different things to help you cope and process. And the communication piece, again, is to make sure you're talking about these things and communicating these needs with your supervisor. And if you're a supervisor, it's taking an effort to communicate what you're trying to do to implement these for the people you're supervising. We can go to the next slide. Now we're going to have a little breakout activity to make sure. We can go to the next slide, please.
Is it the breakout room instruction slide?
It is.
Okay. Can you see my screen? Can everyone see it, or did it freeze?
It froze for me.
I'm gonna go back and then.
Is everyone? So on my end, it looks like everybody else is frozen too, except you, Sadaka. If you all can hear us, just give us one moment, please.
Everyone seems like they can hear us well.
The tech is teching. Okay. Well, if everyone can hear us, can you see breakout room instructions on Sadica's screen?
Yep, I'm getting thumbs up.
Okay, well then it's me. I will go on. So the breakout rooms, we are going to take a few minutes to just go to breakout rooms. It'll be about 10 minutes. You'll have someone in each breakout room from home base. And when we come back, we'll ask you to have like one person from your group share one or two resilient strategies that your group discussed. We can go to the next slide, Sadaka.
Okay, I'm at the next, let's see.
The next slide should have the like the discussion for the breakout room. And then we can switch to the room whenever you are ready.
I'm still seeing folks in the main room, but you all were assigned to like room 1 through 14. So if you see that on your screen, you can hit join.
Sadako, while everyone is in the breakout room, I am going to log out and log back in because my Zoom has frozen.
Yes, no problem.
For folks who are still in the main room, is anyone having trouble finding how to get into a breakout room?
Nicole, do you want to stay in the main room and I'll start checking?
Yeah, that would be great. And I'm gonna try and like broadcast the prompts. So that'll just take me a couple seconds.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Are you all okay in this group?
Yes.
Okay, you all have the prompts. Do you need them again?
No, I remember. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hey, and everyone. It looks like lots of people were finished. Some people are still working with their groups, so we're just giving them some time to come over, and we'll come back to the main room when they're all done. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Looks like a few folks are still coming in from the breakout rooms, and then we will get started. Right, welcome back. Thank you for participating in that activity, and thank you for your grace as my Zoom decided to update in the middle of presentation. So we're gonna take a few minutes to share out. You can drop it in the chat. You can come off mute. I know we had quite a few groups, so whatever is most comfortable for you, drop in the chat. A couple of strategies that your group shared about how you might help yourself recover from this type of work. And just a reminder, we're not sharing about substances, legal or illegal. We just want to share other techniques and strategies that people can use. And this is not to like grade anybody or tell anybody they're doing a bad job or they could be doing better to take care of themselves. Is to provide some strategies and examples to those who may need or want it.
I can go. Um, I'll just say something real quick. I would say like sometimes taking a break outside or going into nature, even if it's just for a moment of fresh air, it helps a lot. And like to each their own, but if you do have friends or colleagues to talk to, it helps to get stressful situations out sometimes in the open if it's feasible for the situation. Everywhere is different, whether it's confidentiality or whatnot. But I would say, yeah, taking a moment to breathe and get out of a space that you're kind of stuck in all day, that's important too. So whether it's taking a walk or talking to a friend or a family member or any of that, um, just ground yourself for a moment and get away from the work day because people do have lives that are outside of work. And so, you know, just recentering, refocusing, however it may be.
Yeah. Thank you. Does anyone else want to share?
3 of the people in our group have dogs. So we were talking about playing with or like taking our dogs for walks. Running errands on the way home to kind of get yourself out of the work mindset and into life mindset was something that was universal. Setting boundaries with like work phones. So either going into do not disturb or leaving it in your car so that it's nowhere even in your space. I talked about how I have a manager who's always accessible, so I can go to her and just say, I'm feeling burnt out. What do I do? Or I'm at my rope's end with this thing. And she's very receptive and aware and conscientious of everyone on our team in that regard. Someone else also mentioned that they restrict or limit work talk with their partner in their space so that their life is and their home life is like sacred. So
I can share. Oh,
Thank you. Go ahead.
yes, so I completely agree about the walking part. I take a walk too, and studies show that people who take those walks tend to have longer lives. And I kind of see the logic behind and the rationale. It's not just good for the mind, it's also really great for the body, right? The exercise we get from taking a walk. And it lends itself so well to kind of incorporating some fun things. Some people like to meditate, and taking a walk and meditation can kind of go together. You can meditate as you walk and kind of enjoy your surroundings and be in the present moment. And some people like listening to music, or listening to some podcasts and talks on their phone while also taking a walk. And I do all of those.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I would say that just practicing general mindfulness about the line of work that we're in is always going to be useful. Truth is, like, we're not a miracle worker, and we don't have $1 trillion to throw at to throw around and all that kind of stuff. So we work with the resources we have. Oftentimes we're underfunded, understaffed, and overworked. And you just got to remember you're not a miracle.
I love that. Thank you. Anyone else want to share? There's no one else. We can go to the next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about basically the organizational culture and the steps to resilience. That's why we talked about some resilience strategies. The organization that fosters great steps to resilience will have a collaborative atmosphere and policies. It's going to foster trust. It's going to support the personal connections that people have, maximize self-care, and then promote staff retention through policy and procedure changes. We can go to the next slide. So now we're talking about supporting staff through resilience culture. Sadaka, are we on slide 38?
Yes.
Thank you. Just so you all are aware, my Zoom is no longer working, so I cannot see what's happening in real time. So we are going to power through, and I absolutely apologize for not looking at you. I'm looking at the slides now. So fostering a collaborative atmosphere as leadership. So leadership is going to be recognizing the successes as team accomplishments. So if one person does well, we are all doing well. And we're recognizing those in like team meetings. We're maybe sending a staff email. We're communicating the expectation that staff are going to kind of work together as a team to support one another. And that might look like some of the strategies we talked about earlier, like restructuring caseloads or making sure that people have the support they need to change tasks when needed. We're going to be receptive to input from staff. So that again looks like supervisors taking into account the suggestions that staff make about how to improve the work environment for themselves. Staff should be included in conversations about decisions that impact their work. And then there should be verbal opportunities for staff to move up within the agency. Now, again, I realize that for some of us, we are not supervisors, and even if we are, we may not have the decision-making ability to implement some of these practices, but these are some of the things that should be happening within an organization. So if you do not have the ability to make these changes and you don't see these things happening, that can be your flag that you need to make sure that you're taking an extra step to take care of yourself, because that's not what's happening in your agency. And then as much as you can, or as much as you are able or comfortable with, making sure that you are communicating those needs. So if there is, for example, a work environment where you never know what other members of the team are doing. You don't know what your colleague who's also managing the same type of cases that you are doing. That could be something to bring up to the higher level, and you could frame it from the perspective of, it would be really great if we as staff had, for example, an opportunity to collaborate about what we're doing with our caseloads and our clients, because we might find some helpful tips or suggestions in that. It could be asking for a specific training. Maybe you need, like, for example, this training, a training on empathy, fatigue, and burnout. Maybe you need a training on like best practices in case management and homeless services, because the last time your agency had a training, it was many, many years ago. And strategies and techniques have changed, especially as the world has changed quite a bit in the last 4 or 5 years. Those are some examples of ways that you can try to foster this collaborative atmosphere if you don't have the kind of decision making ability that's noted in these items on the slide. We can go to the next slide, please. All right, some other examples are promoting from within. So not when there's a supervisory position or a level higher, that the agency is hiring from people who are already there, people who already have the knowledge about the team and how the environment works. Again, reduce arbitrary rules. So that goes with changing those policies and procedures. So changing or reducing arbitrary rules, especially the ones that apply to people who are working one-on-one with the client's frontline staff. So for example, we talked about earlier an example of maybe telling staff that they don't need to come into this 2-hour staff meeting every week because we want them to have more time to do their work. And we are condensing meetings that could be emails, or having a rule that says all staff have to report at 9 a.m. when that's not going to be practical for all staff because somebody may have worked till 8 o'clock the night before. Right, so those are just, again, some examples. Implementing ideas from frontline staff about ways to get the job done better. There is nobody who understands this work better than the people who do it every day. And I think you and I know that sometimes the policies or the practices of our agencies, they just aren't conducive to us really being able to do our work well. And if the powers that be would listen to us, they could make some changes to really make things be a little more smoother for those of us who actually have to do the work. And then agencies can also be flexible, again, with delegating tasks and seeing if other team members can pitch in if needed. We can go to the next slide, please. The grid here just has some examples of the ways that the agency can foster a trusting environment. So ways that staff might be able to trust that their agency is going to take care of them or have their best interests in heart, because that's also important with doing this type of work, again, and reducing the chances that you might experience burnout too. We can go to the next slide, please. Supporting personal connections, again, more things that the agency can do to help staff reduce burnout and empathy fatigue, creating opportunities for staff to build connections outside of the office. So maybe that's funding a staff member who wants to go to a conference or a training that's happening locally or somewhere else, using peer-to-peer cross-training for new hires. So having someone who's more senior in the organization that has done the actual work, training the person who's going to be doing that work next. Building fun shared occasions into annual agency calendar. So maybe there's a staff appreciation day. Maybe there's an annual, cookout, or we all go to a restaurant once a year. Maybe it's an office holiday party. Different things like that can help foster a sense of community and personal connections, team building exercises, but team building exercises that people actually want to do. And what that does is, the goal is to create a situation where different staff members feel some sense of connection to their coworkers, so that you can go and talk to somebody when you need help, that you can ask somebody to take on a task for you because you just can't juggle it all this week. And maybe that person can also feel more comfortable asking you. So that's why we want to have more personal connections within our agencies. We can go to the next slide, please. And these are going to be some examples of how we can maximize self-care. So again, the agency taking on some responsibility for staff participation in self-care. That can be any of the things that we've already talked about, like implementing flexible work schedules and making sure people have access to different resources that might be provided by the agency, like an employee assistance program. Managers can kind of walk the talk and exhibit that they have healthy self-care activities and seek help when they're struggling. So that might look like in supervision meetings, supervisors are saying things like, you know what, I just had a really tough week because it seems like everybody on my team is dealing with difficult stuff. And so next week, instead of having our team meeting, everybody's just going to take the hour to do whatever they want. That can be an example of a manager or a supervisor kind of demonstrating self-care. We can go to the next slide, please. Sorry, everyone, give me one moment, please. Technology is just not my friend today. While we wait for my technology to get itself together, do we have any questions that have come up for people? Feel free to come off mute because I cannot see if your hand is raised too. All right, so now we'll get into policies and procedures. So these are going to be policies and procedures that can basically help the agency to further foster that sense of community or connectedness, and also just help staff generally avoid empathy fatigue and burnout. So the policies and procedures, you could look at this list. They're going to give clear expectations and transparency. They're going to ensure that staff know what resources are available, institutionalize and memorialize change, and ensure consistency across management. And then just overall further strengthen supportive culture within a strength-based language in the policies. And then some of the key areas would be like training and monitoring. That's going to be making sure that staff have the actual knowledge and tools that they need to do the job. Because a lot of times what we see is that the people we're serving, they have more complex needs than what we have the tools to handle. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the clients. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us. It just means that we need the training to be able to handle these issues. And the way that our agencies know we need more training is by us communicating, hey, I'm starting to see a lot of clients that have, this particular issue going on. It would be really helpful if we got some training about how to better deal with this particular issue. Integrating feedback, making sure that access to self-care through benefits are like easy, making sure people know if you need to just talk to somebody about how to debrief, if you feel like you are starting to see signs of empathy fatigue or burnout, here's how you access this free counseling program that we offer through our employee benefits. It is confidential. Nobody is going to tell me as your supervisor what you're saying. This is not going to come back in any way, shape, or form, but you've got 5 free sessions to go talk to somebody else about how you're feeling and to kind of get some help to support you. And then again, scheduling flexibility. So making sure that people have the time they need to take time off. Right, we can go to the next slide, please. And these are just going to be examples of some of the things I just discussed, just some more details. Right, now we can go to the next slide. So it would be ideal if folks would come off mute and just share, like, what's one thing that you're walking away from with this training, or what's one practice you'll be leaving behind after today. And I included this one because I personally hate trainings that leave me with nothing to take away. It feels like I'm not making the best use of my time if I can't go implement this today. So come off mute, drop it in a chat, but one thing you're taking away or one practice you'll be leaving behind. So something you won't be doing anymore after today.
Being able to identify empathy fatigue and burnout in myself and my coworkers.
Thanks for sharing.
I think I'm going to give myself a little bit more grace and be a little bit more brutally honest with like my supervision team that like I'm not necessarily doing okay today, and I need more advice on how to deal with XYZ participants or these scenarios. And I also think to like encourage my partners, my team, to like, we don't have to pretend to be okay if we're not okay.
I love that. Thank you.
I think that I'm gonna take giving myself more grace too, that trying every route isn't the same as exhausting myself, and to be more mindful of that and how it affects my interactions with other clients from that point.
Love that perspective shift. Thank you. Anyone else? If not, we can go to the next slide. Just an opportunity for questions. Any questions you want to ask about today's training? Anything you want some clarification on, we can do that at this time. And then we are all done with the presentation. And the next step will be a post-training survey that Sadaka is going to tell everyone about. So any question about the information today?
Nicole, I just wanted to like run by a scenario that I've been experiencing lately. I work at a family shelter for the unhoused, and you know, CPS reports are a part of our thing, right? And sometimes it's not what you would assume a CPS report to be. It's the assumed neglect component, that when we have to make those reports because we don't have all the facts, we don't, all those things, right? And then those social workers come out and they meet with the families, the parents, and then the parents know that you're the person, or assume that you're the person that made those reports, and then they get angry with you. So I guess my question is like, how do I, as the case manager over those families, try to like rebuild that trust when that is being lost in the moment, and then they don't want to connect, they don't want to meet with you, they don't feel safe anymore. But me feeling empathy fatigue is like, well, I need you to take some accountability because so I'm trying to like let go of that frame and continue with the compassion. You get where I'm coming from?
Absolutely. One thing that I've always suggested, and something I practiced myself, of course, make sure you're 100% familiar with like your reporting requirements for those cases and the limitations on what you can tell the family. But one thing I've always found useful is to disclose that in the beginning. So at the very beginning of our interaction, when we're talking about like roles and responsibilities, I'm sharing, I want to let you know that I'm a mandated reporter. And these are the things that I have to report to CPS if I see them. And I would like you to be involved in that. If anything happens and I have to make the report, I would like to come to you first and have you in the room when I call it in. You know, and that way, at least what I found with the rules in my jurisdiction, that was something that was allowed. Now, obviously, if it was something where like kid is in danger and I've got to make the report without telling the family or the parent so that they can get to where that kid is, that would be a different situation. But when it's like that, I think it's neglect, but I'm not quite sure, I would have the conversation with the client, who the caregiver or the parent, and let them know this is what my concern is, and by law I have to report this because of X, Y, and Z. Do you want to sit in a room while I make the call? And then when I
Mm.
make the call, I am explaining to the CPS worker or the intake person that I'm talking to, I am making this call as a mandated reporter because I do not have all of the information, but I have the parent here with me and they are willing to talk to you and explain the situation. If I
Mm.
can, I am asking the questions of the parent before so that it's no longer an issue of me reporting because I don't have answers to
Mhm.
questions. And I am also doing that with a like cultural lens on,
Mm.
making sure that I am not implying or infusing my own beliefs and standards about what constitutes, adequate child care and supervision onto this family, and really just stopping and asking those safety questions.
Okay. And I'll definitely bring that up to my supervisor, because that's a really great piece of advice, because it's kind of, maybe I'm wrong, but it's kind of feels like we are not supposed to discuss this with the client when we're making those calls. And I've kind of been instructed to make these calls by my supervision team. Like, so yeah, it's a little conflicting, but it's a great perspective to bring to them in my next supervision meeting. So thank you so much, Nicole. It's been a great training.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I hope it works out and you get some clarity. Any other questions?
This might be a different training. So you can just disregard this if it doesn't really fit in with this. But I find that my burnout comes more from trying to navigate, feeling like the powerlessness that comes from navigating broken systems. And how do you mitigate? And I feel like that powerlessness then lends itself to be, I don't know if it's empathy fatigue, but there's definitely a bit of like, I know from past experience already that there's nothing I can do for this person. And I don't know what I can do for them. And that's because I've run, I've gone every route with someone else. So I like know that there's nothing I can do for that person. What what kind of advice or guidance would you give in like that instance and like that level of burnout?
I would ask follow-up question, is that like, is what you're describing like a one client thing, like really tough situation, or is it like there's nothing I can do for any of these people because the game is rigged?
There's a large amount, there's a sizable portion of my caseload where I know from conversations with systems, with people, with trying to navigate with other clients, that there's that I know this person is going to die on the street, basically. And what do you do when like that kind of burnout is happening and that powerlessness is seeping into your work?
I love that question because that's like the realest question ever. And hopefully my advice does not get me in trouble. I don't think it will because I've got one of those nice agencies we talked about. Again, personal experience. That is why I don't practice social work anymore. That is why I became an attorney, seeing and not necessarily saying that that's the key for you, but it got to the point where, like you, it was all of these clients, big systemic issue, dying in the street. There's no fix for this. The question for me became, can I continue to just either accept that, somebody's going to fall outside of the helping bubble, or do I want to try to do something to fix the systemic issue? I went with trying to do something to fix the systemic issue, which is why I'm doing this now. I'm a technical assistance provider at home base instead of, working in the shelters as the case manager, as the shelter director. I ended up here, and I'll tell you, I went through the whole cycle. Like I was a case manager, and then I was a shelter director, and then I was like, I'm going to law school, and I'm going to be an attorney, and I'm going to work on, litigating these cases that deal with some of these systemic issues, and that didn't work for me, and that's how I ended up here. So it was literally, I was burnt out of teaching people how to work through the system or navigate the system, and tired of accepting that some people are falling through the holes and it's designed to be that way, like jaded, tired, exhausted, all of that. So I left and found a place where I can use some of the skills that I learned, and some of that experience to help in a different way. And again, personally, that has been huge for me. And I've heard the same from other direct service providers. For some of us, we reach a point where we've got to find another way to serve because we are tired and burned out. And it's okay and totally natural if that's the case for you at this phase. Because nobody tells us that when we start. Like, nobody tells us it's okay to leave. Nobody tells us that you're going to hit your wall at some point. But for some of us, that's what happens. And that is what we have to do to take care of ourselves. I'm sorry I didn't have more roses and rainbows.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for your candor.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? If not, that is the end of the information portion of this training. Sadaka, if you want to take back over with the survey information, it's all back to you.
So in the chat, I have put a feedback survey that we would like you all to fill out. It shouldn't take much time. Again, thank you for coming to today's training. And before you all leave too, I will be sending out the slides, and the slides also include resources and references. And so please pay attention to the SPN or COC listserv, where I will update you all on when the recording and the slides will be posted on the Santa Clara County COC website. Again, thank you all for attending today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email at saadiqiah@homebasecc.org. And I'll put it in the chat too, just in case folks didn't catch that. Again, thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I don't know. I don't know what happened to my game. Oh, there it goes. I was like, what happened to the Zoom? You cannot do. Okay.